On Issues and Insiders today, we address advances in Seoul-Tokyo ties amid a host of security challenges. So what is the latest on the bilateral diplomatic front? How far have the two countries advanced on the economic front? And are prospects of a summit between Japan and North Korea high? Welcome to yet another edition of Issues and Insiders. It's Thursday here in Korea and I'm Sunhee. Media reports from neighboring Japan claim Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is planning a trip to South Korea ahead of his hopes to directly engage North Korea over a broad range of concerns, including the issue of abduction of Japanese nationals by North Korean agents in the 1970s and 80s. For more on this, I have Doctor Ban Kil Joo at Korea University live on the line. Dr. Ban, welcome back.
Good afternoon. Good to be here.
I also have Doctor Kim Yang-gyu at the East Asia Institute with us. Dr. Kim, it's good to see you again.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Ban, let's begin off then with your assessment of diplomatic ties between Seoul and Tokyo under the Yoon administration.
Well, I would like to assess that under the Yoon administration, the two countries are more cooperative, and the two leaders, President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida, are close individually and trust each other, leading the two countries to be more connected militarily as well as diplomatically. What made these ties possible? We need to take a look at the Yoon administration diplomatic architecture. I would say that the first season of Yoon administration diplomatic architecture can be defined as a security diplomacy, where South Korea intends to significantly enhance security cooperation with an ally and a security partner. This security diplomacy led to the strongest alliance in history, as shown the birth of NCG, Nuclear Consultative Group. The second item for Yoon administration security diplomacy would be security cooperation between South Korea and Japan. Previously, Japan was far from South Korea's security partner. South Korea and Japan have rarely engaged even diplomatically. However, when the Yoon administration was inaugurated in 2022, it had to address serious challenges from both more heavily nuclear-armed North Korea and faltering international organizations. The remedy that the Yoon administration made was a trilateral relationship between South Korea, the United States, and Japan. This idea has been realized by the Camp David Summit, as you all know. This trilateral summit helped greatly enhanced the ROK-US alliance, but at the same time contributed to tackling the deadlocked ROK-Japan relationship. As of right now, officials from South Korea and Japan meet more often through this trilateral platform. These two countries step up security cooperation through this trilateral framework like TISA, Trilateral Information Sharing Arrangement. More importantly, South Korea and Japan have improved bilateral cooperation as well. Shuttle diplomacy between South Korea and Japan has revived to function. The deadlocked GSOMIA, General Security Military Information Agreement, has begun to fully functional. In the meantime, there are several agendas that South Korea and Japan have to deal with, which include history and wastewater release. However, I believe that the improved bilateral relationships help these issues be addressed gradually as time goes by.
Right, hopefully, of course. And Dr. Kim, keeping in mind what Dr. Ban has just said, do you suppose security concerns over North Korea's hostile weapons ambitions will continue to keep Seoul-Tokyo in close coordination on the diplomatic front?
Yes, indeed. I think Dr. Ban already mentioned beautifully and explained everything. But let me just add a couple of things. Especially since 2022, Pyongyang has been doing everything to make the nuclear threat to South Korea, Japan, and the United States as credible as possible. The regime passed a law on nuclear forces and then made it a part of the constitution, and thus making it illegal for Pyongyang to embark on denuclearization measures. And starting this year, Kim Jong-un even declared that he has a legal right to annihilate South Korea. But however, if there is an action, there is a reaction. The DPRK's action to protect the regime by making nuclear war threat led to reactions in Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington, including Washington Declaration, Nuclear Consultative Group, as just Dr. Ban mentioned, and Camp David Summit, and numerous vice ministerial strategic dialogues, which have significantly reinforce the U.S. extended deterrence and integrated deterrence system in the region. And according to the recent Korea-Japan Joint Public Opinion Survey conducted by the East Asia Institute and the Genron NPO, more than 70% of the people, both Korea and Japan, want some level of security cooperation between the two countries, either information sharing or coordination body for joint actions. And about 10% of them in each country even believe a military alliance is needed. Can you believe this? Korea-Japan military alliance. So this is something that I've never expected about 5 or 6 years ago. And I think as long as there's action from DPRK to intensify military provocations, there will be a strengthening of bilateral cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo.
Right, so advances on the diplomatic front are clear then, Dr. Ban, and keeping that in mind, where do Seoul and Tokyo stand on bilateral economic initiatives?
To be honest, the improved diplomatic relationship between South Korea and Japan contributes to making their bilateral relationship better as well. As you might be aware, in March 2023, as Japan withdrew the exclusion of South Korea from the whitelist, South Korea and Japan agreed to normalize their economic dependence. Furthermore, in November 2023, South Korea and Japan agreed to establish a supply chain for hydrogen and ammonia as part of the effort to enhance economic security. Their bilateral economic cooperation also includes the areas of semiconductors and quantum technology. Moreover, as of right now, the need for a more consolidated bilateral economic architecture is gaining momentum. For example, in December 2023, Chairman Choi Tae-won of SK Group suggested ROK-Japan Economic Cooperation Initiative, which includes numerous areas for bilateral cooperation such as energy, semiconductors, shipbuilding, mobility, batteries, and even tourism. But at the same time, the bilateral economic cooperation between South Korea and Japan is less active than cooperation through multilateral or unilateral platforms. The typical unilateral framework that South Korea and Japan attend together is obviously the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and the ROK-US-Japan Cooperative Architecture. In a nutshell, as of right now, I would say that these two countries are better at security cooperation than economic cooperation from a bilateral viewpoint.
Right, I see. And Dr. Kim, this next concern was something that Dr. Ban touched upon earlier on, but do differences over history between the two countries look to hinder greater advances on both the diplomatic and economic fronts?
Unfortunately, this will always be the case, but let me share some interesting findings from the Joint Public Opinion Survey that I just mentioned. The top 3 responses of both Korean and Japanese people to the question of what needs to be done to improve Seoul-Tokyo relations were all related to historical problems, from the historical education issue to doctor dispute. Interestingly, however, when it comes to defining this historical problem, the majority of South Koreans, ranging from 60 to 65%, think of wartime aggressions, textbook issues, forced labor, and comfort women issue. On the contrary, Japanese respondents think of anti-Japanese education, excessive reactions regarding historical issues, and unfair media reports when they hear history problem. So you see, although everybody believes that the history problem should be addressed to open a new era for bilateral relations, they understand and perceive the same concept differently. This is why strengthening bilateral relations is so difficult. Both sides need to make persistent efforts to overcome this fundamental gap in their perceptions first, and this will take a lot of time.
Right, of course. Dr. Ban, moving forward, there is talk about a possible visit to Seoul by Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in March, that's next month, to discuss a number of issues, including Tokyo's efforts to engage Pyongyang, especially in light of a favorable response from North Korea's Kim Yang-gyu regarding prospects of a summit between her brother and Prime Minister Kishida. First, then, what are your thoughts, Dr. Ban, regarding the possibility of a Kishida Kim Summit?
To start with, I'm not sure whether Prime Minister Kishida is really scheduled to visit South Korea, in the sense that Prime Minister Kishida visited Seoul in May last year, and it is rival time for the South Korean president to make a return visit to Tokyo based upon the logic of shadow diplomacy. Meanwhile, since this is not a strict rule at all, this order could be changed if there are specific events like Major League Baseball, which is scheduled to be held on 30 March. But it remains to be seen whether his visit happens really on the spot. If Prime Minister Kishida visits Seoul indeed, that visit is not simply going to be symbolic, but substantial in the sense that this visit means that order is going to be changed. Regardless of the feasibility of Prime Minister Kishida's visit to Seoul, as you mentioned earlier, the possibility of a Kishida Kim Summit is gaining attention. However, I don't think it is highly possible because, first, Kim Yo-jong's favorable comment toward Japan is strategically designed, and Japan is well aware of North Korea's strategic calculation. The underlying logic that Kim Yo-jong made a favorable response to Japan has something to do with the fact that South Korea made a diplomatic relation with Cuba, North Korea's brother country, obviously. Cuba's diplomatic normalization seems to have shocked North Korea, as we can see North Korea's intentional attempts to exclude Cuba in its press. In addition, North Korea strategically intends to derail the newly emerged ROK-US-Japan security architecture and the ROK-Japan cooperative relationship while using a gray zone strategy. So Japan, as well as South Korea and the United States, will be careful not to be entrapped in North Korea's strategic calculation. Second, agendas between North Korea and Japan are colliding in many ways. The most important reason why Japan needs to engage with North Korea diplomatically is to address the issue of the Japanese adopted by North Korea. However, North Korea maintains the problem of all Japanese adoptees has been resolved while being reluctant to repatriate to Japan. If Prime Minister Kishida meets Kim Jong-un without bringing this agenda to the table, he is most likely to be punished politically by the domestic audience. When all these things are taken into consideration, I don't think the Kishida Kim Summit is feasible. Meanwhile, the return of Trump to the White House could change this mechanism and Japan's calculation.
Right. Dr. Kim, what are your thoughts? Do you also share this rather reserved outlook with regard to prospects of a Kishida Kim summit? I mean, do you believe that the abduction issue perhaps will keep this particular summit from taking place?
Yes, absolutely. I think Dr. Ban already answered this question pretty well. So let me add a couple more details to the story. I just want to highlight that according to recent official statement of Prime Minister Kishida, Tokyo's position is twofold. One, the abduction issue is one of the highest priority issues for the Kishida administration, as it is a human rights issue and an issue with time constraints as the families of the victims continue to age. And two, Kishida is also determined to meet Kim Jong-un to address the abduction issue without setting any condition. However, like you just mentioned, Kim Yo-jong, the Supreme Leader's sister and the Vice Department Director of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party, said that DPRK and Japan can open up a new future, which means Pyongyang would welcome Kishida's visit to the DPRK only if the adoption issue and the nuclear and missile issues will not be on the table. She then, of course, qualified her statement that this is only her personal view and she is not in the position to officially comment on this. But we all know that, considering her position in the regime, you can see that Kim Jong-un will meet Kishida if they agree not to talk about abduction issue. But this issue is specifically the very reason why Kishida wants to meet Kim Jong-un. So there's a collision in the agenda setting, as just Dr. Ban just mentioned. So this is why many experts, including Dr. Ban and me, that the Kishida Kim Summit will not happen and warn that it is simply a tactic by Pyongyang to drive a wedge in Seoul, Washington, Tokyo trilateral cooperation by feeding fears to South Korea that Japan might unilaterally deal with the DPRK behind its back. And I agree with this analysis, and I believe the DPRK's Japan summit is highly unlikely unless Pyongyang shows some sign of changing its positions on the abduction issue. But North Korea has never changed its position since 2006. I don't think it's going to change now.
Right, so while the prospects then remain very low, Dr. Ban, as you mentioned, if the summit does take place and includes the abduction issue, the political gains for Prime Minister Kishida are very, very clear. That being said, what does North Korea's Kim Jong-un look to gain if such a summit does indeed take place?
Honestly, if that happens, Kim Jong-un's diplomatic landscape is expected to be much broader. As you all know, the Kim regime has been eager to make nuclear weapons for quite a long time. The 7 years of gradual strategy for making nuclear weapons allowed Kim Jong-un to be finally armed with nuclear weapons. We need to pay attention to what he is doing right now after being fully armed with nuclear weapons. Two things are clear. One is to step up its nuclear coercion on the United States as well as South Korea to press these countries to take its request. This nuclear coercion is closely linked to guaranteeing its regime survival. Second, Kim Jong-un's attempts to play an enhanced role in the international arena while taking advantage of its status as a nuclear power, although it has not been recognized as an official nuclear power by international society. That explains why Kim Jong-un visited Russia last year, and North Korea has recently begun to intervene in many issues, including the Israeli-Hamas war. Meanwhile, this second objective is oriented toward expanding its diplomatic horizon. So, the North Korea-Japan summit is most likely to help Kim Jong-un achieve its goal of enhancing its diplomatic influence as a nuclear power. Moreover, this enhanced status is expected to help Kim Jong-un mitigate domestic grievances drawn from food crisis and economic poverty. In a nutshell, Kim Jong-un has a lot to achieve through this bilateral summit.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Dr. Kim, back to Seoul-Tokyo ties. Now, as Dr. Ban has mentioned, the actual prospects of a visit by Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to Seoul have yet to be formally acknowledged. But if it does occur, some pundits claim that Kishida's visit to Seoul, especially ahead of the parliamentary election here in the country in April, would reflect favorably on the Yoon administration. What are your thoughts?
Well, election and domestic politics in South Korea are well beyond my expertise, but let me share this. The joint public opinion survey that I just mentioned now, it shows very interesting trends. While the majority of both Korean and Japanese respondents say that bilateral relations are improving, this does not have the same impact on both countries. Specifically, Japanese perception towards South Korea has greatly improved, with 32.8% stating that their impression of Korea is favorable, the highest score ever since we started the survey. However, Korean perception toward Japan has slightly deteriorated from 2022 to 2023. The percentage of Koreans who responded favorable decreased from 30.4% to 28.9%. Through regression analysis, I found that two most powerful factor that led to South Koreans' unfavorability towards Japan were President Yoon's policy to improve Seoul-Tokyo ties and the Kishida administration policy toward South Korea. So what I can say is that Yoon government's Japan policy is not very popular in Korea. And the picture of President Yoon watching a Major League Baseball game in Seoul with Prime Minister Kishida will not help the ruling party that much during the general election in April, I believe.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, moving forward, Dr. Ban, late last year, there was much talk about the possibility of a trilateral summit among South Korea, Japan and China in the near future. Do you share this outlook? And should such a trilateral interaction take place, what issues do you believe should be addressed?
Well, South Korea as a host country has been enthusiastic about making a trilateral summit feasible since last year, as you noted. Japan has responded favorably to South Korea. Furthermore, China has sent a favorable signal to South Korea regarding a trilateral summit, although in general, South China seems away from the current South Korean administration. But at the same time, there seems no further advancements to this diplomatic journey at the moment. Why is that? Well, China appears to calculate several factors, such as general election in South Korea, the election in Japan, and the feasibility of Trump's return to the White House. In this respect, diplomatic efforts might be more active in the post-election period. Quite a number of agendas are expected to be dealt with if a trilateral summit takes place. The first issue is most likely to be the Taiwan issue because it serves as the most conflicting agenda between the three countries. China is most likely to press again South Korea and Japan to embrace its one China policy simply beyond respecting this policy. In contrast, South Korea and Japan are most likely to maintain their current position, which is their objection to a revisionist attempt by power regarding Taiwan. Second, North Korea's nuclear provocation should not be excluded. At this summit, they need to reconfirm that North Korea should be denuclearized and sanctions against North Korea need to be maintained without any glitch. Moreover, South Korea is likely to request China to step up its role in denuclearizing North Korea and deterring North Korea's provocations. Third, non-military cooperation could be on the agenda as well, which includes maritime cooperation and coordinated climate response. Finally, economic security could be on the list in a situation where the discourse of de-risking is in the works and the global supply chain is being redesigned.
Right, all these issues, if of course the Trilateral Summit does indeed take place. All right, Dr. Ban, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Dr. Kim, thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Right, well, that ends this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. We are looking ahead to a long weekend starting tomorrow, that is Friday, which marks Independence Movement Day here in Korea. See you next Monday.